very strongly believe in the future be seen as his most significant contribution. History will tell us that Charles Correa was Asia's first modern architect, and perhaps the first in the global south that created and articulated a position about architecture and its practice globally. So I think this is a very, very important point, and I think we'll have to be patient through history. Maybe our generations won't even enjoy this sort of reading of Charles Correa, but I'm confident it'll be one that we'll, as a profession, and at MIT in 55, and then he returned to India in 1956 to work in what was a new nation state, brimming with optimism. And it was within this sort of imagination of a new through colonization, but also an imagination of the modern. It was also a society at that point which was fraught with inequities. This is a wonderful which captures Nehru and Corbusier imagining a new India, but what lurks in the background. And so this notion of inequity also was one in which Charles Correa started his practice with all the optimism that was happening. Charles Correa, when he returned, this is an archival image, would have been about 27 or 28, I think, in this image, came back into this context as a young person, beginning with incredible ambitions to make an architecture for India. And I just want to share with you something that he wrote when he was 26, which in a sense really defined the agenda for the rest of his career, for the 60 years of practice. And he said, and I quote, he said, "Perhaps Indian architecture will be like Mozart, a great lyricism and in the center of a clear, concise idea, as clean and hard as a theorem. The house around the courtyard, the clear statement, the tree, the shadows, the texture, providing rhythm and patterns and counterpoints." And amazing, I mean, if you look at that sort of writing for someone at 26, and then you see an oeuvre of work, you can see the kind of clarity in the sense of his own vision. And then for him, the next 55 or 56 extremely productive years, constructing this imagination and extending it to the entire landscape of the nation, its cities, its villages, and the representation of these ideas around the world. Charles Correa's imagination of India was one where the deepest cultural memories were valid sources of nourishment and imagination for architecture, but necessarily coexisted with contemporary realities of uneven development, of inequities, and of poverty that were equally important challenges that nourished the architect's imagination. Charles Correa's brilliance, I believe, lay in his deft, simultaneous engagement across the spectrum of issues. In this broad spectrum of engagements, a few projects clearly stood out and came to define his approach and his originality as a thinker, activist, and a theorist. So I'm going to just run you through some of these. And we all know the first one and the earliest one was, which I think epitomized his courage and clarity of expression, was the Gandhi Ashram in Ahmedabad, which he did in 1958. He designed it. He was just 28 years old. And then the Hindustan Lever project that he did as a pavilion in 61 at the age of 31 in New Delhi. Both these projects were completely different architectural expressions, and more importantly, they represented his own struggle as a young architect to construct an appropriate architecture for a new nation, in which architecture continued to be largely handmade and dependent on craft, reconciling these modes of production with the modernist tenets in Western sensibilities of architectural production. So for this first generation of architects in independent India, it was a struggle to make modernism work in how they would place their own modernity within a cultural context and allow it to be subsumed by the process of the creation of local identities and cultural norms. And so Correa's architecture employed simple construction in these projects, ordinary elements, but they brought them together in stunningly beautiful ways. And so this was Gandhi's ashram, which existed in Ahmedabad, a veranda on both sides, very ambiguous space. The plan is interesting of that ashram. This wall actually divides two verandas. So there is no inside-outside except for very few rooms. It's very ambiguous spaces. And he managed to pick this essence when he designed the building as an extension, which is a series of pavilions where space completely ambiguously flowed through, blurring this boundary between what is open, what is closed. There was no glass used, it was naturally ventilated, etc. And for someone at 28 to imagine this at the beginning of his career is absolute brilliance. And the Hindustan lever pavilion, which was sort of even much more complicated, I'm sorry, I only have an internal image, but it was this asymmetry of folded plates using ferro cement, which really was popular in the West 30 years later, but he did this very, very early. Soon after these early works and the establishment of his practice in Mumbai, his tryst with urbanism opened a large range of new avenues in his future work, both in terms of scale, but also as an activist who became obsessed with the transformation of Indian cities. In 1964, with his colleagues Praveena Mehta and Shirish Patel, Correa proposed New Bombay, which was for the time very much ahead. Many of the, like your CMDA, came out of the MMRDA, which was the Metropolitan Regional Development Authority. And what this really did for the first time in independent India was began to move the urban to a regional scale, to look at planning in holistic ways. And it was interesting because this also led for him many preoccupations with housing, because he saw housing and urbanism as being intrinsically linked. And so these are diagrams that he was trying to show us how public transportation was intrinsically linked to housing, and how subsidy for public transportation was the best form of indirect subsidy on housing. So many of these sort of ecological concerns within the imagination of the urban became very clear, and he became very obsessed with housing and urbanization as an intrinsically linked activity. And of course, he looked carefully at slums, he looked at this inequity, and he tried to resolve it through projects that he did. And of course, there were many, many housing projects he did, and this book actually documents it, but I'll just touch upon two. One was, of course, what Sitco called the artist village, but it was really a form of housing where he was trying to reconcile these different sort of income groups within the housing. But what the authorities did was mass housing, which is the regular kind of housing. And this is the difference, because this is what the government does, and this is what he tried to do. So it takes the intelligence of what is self-made housing, but begins to give it a DNA and give it a pattern so that it can be. And he looked at income groups, he tried to find ways that the lowest income groups could be brought into the housing fold, and therefore this was an intersection between economics, society, social, political sorts of questions. And he challenged the row house system, and he showed how you could create much richer clusters with the same efficiency. I think there was a 2% difference in the efficiency between these, but the quality of life was much greater. And he did calculations to show how it wasn't much more services, it was all quite equal, came up with many typologies of how the house could grow, the organic quality of what really housing is about, and he kind of demonstrated it through these prototypes that were built. And this is how it's been occupied. It's very rich, people take it over, and this is where it is human-centric, because it begins to create a DNA for what he called the self-help city. And the DNA is what sort of sustains. But within this debate on housing, for me what is very, very interesting is that these were the sensibilities used there. But when he designed his own house in Bangalore, it was the same principle. So whether it was a poor man's house or a person who could afford a larger house, the principles and the values were the same. And this is a house in Bangalore which was used as a studio for a while, and which was organized around a courtyard. And you look at the vocabulary of that, it's not different from the vocabulary of Belapur housing, which was for the poorest in society. And so therefore, how architecture can, as a visual instrument, also dissipate this idea of inequities, because now we are building forms that clearly tell you someone is rich and someone is poor. And his aspiration was how you could blur that through architectural formulation. And that's the interior of the house, and you can of course say it's much more sophisticated, but spatially it's not different from that. And of course, these experiments, he looked at the Tube House, which was a low-cost house where he won a competition again when he was very young, where he took the section of the house, and by creating lofts and things, which is what people do when they build their own houses, he got much more space and ventilation, etc. And then another project which I think is significant is the project in Lima in Peru, where he was invited with 12 other international architects, including James Sterling, Markey, and many others, Aldo Van Eyck, and he did a whole sector of housing there, which was called the Previ project, and a very famous project internationally, which I think also brought him into recognition. I was very fortunate to visit this last year and look at some of the houses, and what a rich environment it has. These are courtyards. It was built through a prefabricated system outside Lima. And what is interesting is, keep this image in your mind where you see a courtyard and a passage. And it's no different from the Ramakrishna house, which he built for very rich industrialists in Ahmedabad. So the same kinds of principles. Of course, the house gets bigger, but the resonance of the same set of values is very, very important. And of course, I think, for me, the highest point of the exploration of these ideas was the Kanchenjunga apartment, which within the forces of urbanism and high land values, he found us a solution, which was truly seminal in establishing, I believe, a regionalist approach within the tenets of very rigorous modernism. In this case, for a high-rise apartment building. Here, the constraints of land and real estate, floor areas, climate, lifestyle, construction technologies, and beauty all intersect in the most elegant fashion to make what will perhaps be, I think, one of the most enduring creations in the city of Bombay, and by one which I think Charles Correa will really be remembered. This is an image of the Boyce houses, which was in Pune. It was an unbuilt project. But what was interesting is really this is the beginning of Kanchenjunga, where he begins to take volumes and he begins to stack them. It was unbuilt. And you can see how this was for a lower rise housing project. But those same ideas then developed into Cosmopolis apartments, which was also not built. And this is all the origins of Kanchenjunga in a sense, and you see the double height spaces. And then finally it becomes Kanchenjunga, but the first version is just a straight repetition, which he said was like yardage when you sold cloth. And therefore he began to make poetry out of it by twisting the double heights in different asymmetrical ways. And so there was a great evolution of these ideas and very spectacular spaces that then look, and the way it sits within the landscape, it clearly stands out as a piece of beautiful architecture in this otherwise rather ordinary city. And these ideas he captured in this book called The New Landscape, which again I think is one of his most seminal contributions, because it encapsulates these ideas very vividly, and his experiences in planning for New Bombay, the gamut of housing projects, etc. And it serves, I believe, as a primer for any young architect practicing in Asia, the Third World, or the Global South more broadly. For it was through these explorations in housing and urbanization that Correa really articulated for a whole generation of architects in Asia the power and the agency of design in making our cities and built environments much more human. Now, in recognition of his presence as an architect, as a public intellectual, etc., the state, the Indian government, I think gave him many commissions, Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, the LIC building in Delhi, many of which you will all know, but I don't want to sort of go into that. But I think for me, one of the important things was that they appointed him, the government of India, Vipul Jaikar, who you see here, appointed him to curate the exhibition Vistara, which was, I believe, for the profession, a real milestone, because it's the first time that the profession, that somebody articulated the history of Indian architecture in modern post-independent India. And these exhibitions actually intended, the festivals of India, to showcase the deep traditions of India to the world outside, and became an ideal forum for Correa to articulate the ideas that he had sensed intuitively and experienced through his years of practice in India. The final product of this commission was this exhibition titled Vistara, and this international exhibition, which was held between 83 and 86, presented a narrative of India's architectural traditions. It highlighted how urban and folk paradigms had been seamlessly integrated in the architecture of India through the ages. It made the range of architectural production in India, from the vernacular to the monumental, appear seamless and interconnected by the idea that architecture was myth-based, expressing the presence of a reality more profound than the manifest world in which we live and exist. And this was something that had become a bit of an intellectual preoccupation for him, because the exhibition inadvertently challenged the architect, all of us in India, to move in and embrace more divergent directions in such a way that the past, present could be configured to construct the future. More importantly, it also implicitly shifted the gaze from the industrial, urban, and modern India to village, rural, and ancient India as the site of intellectual nourishment for architects and architectural identity production. The result of this engagement for me was twofold. Firstly, it was an interesting moment for the discourse of architecture in India in response to the concurrently postmodern debates that were evolving in the West. Because while Western architects employed symbolism in their postmodern vocabularies in a very facile manner, Correa opened up the possibility for Indian architects to grapple with representing their history by being inspired by traditional spatial configurations and not just decoration. And I think this was critical because perhaps it was his own personal search for how to respond to the wave of postmodernism happening in the West that he really did this. Secondly, it gave a new spurt of energy to Correa's own buildings in the next 25 years of practice. His architecture now developed a new layer of metaphysical references and spatial qualities that were intended to provoke a deep structure in the recesses of our mind and challenge our own intuitions to connect to our history. And so the Jawahar Kala Kendra was one building that I believe came out of these exercises, and it kind of shows us how he organized within a very simple matrix a very complex set of spaces, but he also employed, sometimes literally, sometimes more implicitly, the crafts of traditional India. And Bharat Bhavan, which was already happening simultaneously, also picked on connecting to some of these tribal cultures and events, and a great complexity. I think it's one of the most poetic, I mean, not looked after very well, because that's what's unfortunately the problem with our government buildings, but as a conceptual idea, a very powerful idea for a parliament in the way people come together, what he called the palace of democracy. And a very complex building and a very poetic building in the way you sort of experience and how you move through it. And I just want to touch upon this. Harsh has already touched upon this, and you know, and a good architecture also needs a good patron. And I mean, of his own admission, Harsh has told us how he was brave enough to challenge Mr. Correa with both a project in terms of a program like a shopping mall. And again, this is an amazing example where a whole new typology comes out of that exercise. And of course, it's painful when we all go through it, but the results are amazing because it really became a place. It was more not a commercial thing. I mean, I think this really became a place in the deepest sense. And I was talking to some people last night, and they said, you know, they were born in Calcutta, and at the time they were old enough to go to public spaces. Their imagination of Calcutta was that city center was an intrinsic part of it. But this idea that I think Harsh also explained, and I love this T-junction, where suddenly the bazaar, the traditional market, new sensibilities of commerce and retail all come together in a kind of magical way. And so in his last phase, in the last decades of his practice, Correa built abroad a lot, and he did 3 significant buildings. This is for the Aga Khan. It's a Jamaat Khana in Toronto, which was a competition that he won, and it's an incredible space. This is an image I took a few weeks ago, and it's all in glass. It's in double-layer glass, but you really feel you're sitting under a tent because it has the lightness of the tent as the light filters through, and it kind of evokes the deepest sort of sensibilities of what this nomadic culture of Islam as it moved around might have felt like. And from the outside, of course, it has a great presence on the city. The Brain Sciences building, which he did at MIT, was again a complex piece of architecture. And then, of course, the building in Lisbon, which was really his last project, and we've seen enough about it. In ending, I just want to say that this was a tribute that Nandita paid to him in the month of March. It was an exhibition which was called Buildings as Ideas. I hope it can travel maybe here to Kolkata someday, but it was a wonderful exhibition where she traced 80 unbuilt projects of Charles Correa's, projects that didn't get realized, but she showed in the exhibition how those projects led up to ideas for other projects. That's why it was called Buildings as Ideas. And it's I think it really did turn out to be a wonderful exhibition where she mapped different projects, how much time they took, what it overlapped with. So you also began to see a pattern through different times in India of the gestation period of projects. And just to end and to talk about, to summarize what I at least personally see as this legacy, and I think it's more important, and I put this map up because I believe this is the future of India. We are sitting in Kolkata, I come from Mumbai, we talk about Bangalore, Hyderabad, we talk about a few cities which are those mega cities which all our intellectual capital is focused on. There are 28 tier 2 cities. Actually, these numbers, depending on how you call them, we can name maybe half of them collectively. There are 393 cities which will become 1 million people. And I can challenge us, the 300 people sitting here, we'll be able to not name all 393. These are off our radar. This is going to be the future of India. And I think many ideas that Charles Correa evolved for urbanism, for housing, they will resonate deeply in these places. And for the next generation, that is where we should be looking, and that is where the legacy of Charles Correa will become even much more profoundly important. And therefore, it's important to keep these ideas in discussion, because I think their afterlife is something that carries hope. Because I think Charles Correa's legacy for India will be that he was the most important figure in the first generation of architects in independent India. His contribution of articulating a clear agenda for architects in India was critical. His ability to theorize the everyday in productive ways for designers and construct a clear idea of India will be an everlasting impact. To take the obscure agendas of modernism and root them in the Indian reality will serve as the foundation for many generations in India. But more importantly, Charles Correa will be seen as, and I believe, as an architect whose agenda was about creating relevant and humane architecture and cities, and doing this with great integrity in a landscape of mediocrity, hypocrisy, and extreme greed. In the future, his ideas, I believe, will become much more powerful, relevant, and resonate more broadly in our globalizing world, in the global south. In fact, as I started in my introduction, I think Charles Correa perhaps will be seen as the first Asian architect, or an architect of the global south, or what a Bangladeshi photographer has now called the majority world. The majority world is in the global south. And this is where his ideas, I think he was the first person who articulated them with such coherence that they will resonate as we begin talking to each other. And it is precisely for this reason that we decided we should have Solano come and speak to us, because Latin America is where his ideas resonate as much as in India. And for us to start this dialogue across this global south, where the majority world lives, where our ideas, our problems, our issues, our economy, maybe our cultures, our post-colonial conditions, our sense of time, all resonates equally. And for us to have that conversation not through the West, but among ourselves, is very critical. And it is this really that Solano will bring to what he will show to us. It's the same values, it's the same landscape where frugality means a lot and resonates very broadly. It is the South-South dialogue that I think we should set up. Solano has been practicing in Paraguay. That is the country that he sort of has come from. He's come a long way. He's traveled 40 hours to be with us. That is more particularly his country. This is where he practices. You see the red dot. He will talk more about it. It's in the center of Latin America. It's plateau landscape with the Andes on one side. It also faces the post-colonial conditions that we do and a host of problems. His practice, which he does with Gloria and Solanito, is a professional instructor that promotes architecture, applying research in the area of design, construction, and education. And he has integrated the partnership through philosophy, with artists, with economists, with historians, and he's created a really hybrid model of practice, which I believe is really relevant for us, and particularly relevant in a state like Bengal for many, many reasons. And his research is very integral to his practice. He has done projects that involve social projects, houses, and experimental structures, and has been awarded greatly. He won the first BSI Swiss Award when it was established, and just recently he did a wonderful installation in the Venice Biennale, which is using brick. It uses 1/3 the amount of bricks that you would need to cover a space as large as that. It's 7 meters high. And he was complimented on this and recognized, and he was given the Golden Lion, which is the highest award at the Venice Biennale, well, 4 weeks ago, and an honor for that. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and with that I invite Solano to deliver the first Charles Memorial Lecture here in Kolkata. Thank you very much.